The gala began at 8, and by the time the sun came up over Biscayne Bay, 4 of the richest people in Miami were finished. A fifth was in handcuffs, and the woman they'd spent the whole night laughing at was standing on the terrace in a gold dress, watching the light come up over a hotel that used to belong to her father. They'd mocked the dress at the door. They'd mocked it at dinner. Not one of them had thought to ask why a nobody would wear something that bright to a room full of wolves. "You wore gold to your own funeral," Camilla Ashford had whispered, delighted. Nora Bennett had only smiled and checked the time. There was a storm sitting out over the water that night, the kind Miami gets in the wet months. No rain yet, just a wall of heat and pressure and far-off lightning that turned the bay the color of a bruise and the promise that it would break before morning. The Castellane was the most beautiful hotel on the bayfront. Everyone said so. Coral stone and hurricane glass, a terrace that hung out over the water, a lobby where the air itself felt expensive. Cesare Bruno had built it. Everyone said that too. He'd been very generous about the arts wing and the children's ward and the ribbon cuttings, and the city had decided to remember him the way he wanted to be remembered, and to forget the parts that didn't flatter the story. Nora Bennett stood in the entrance and let her valet take nothing from her, because she'd brought nothing, and she looked up at the coral stone and thought, he even kept the staircase, because the Castellane had another name once. Before the rebrand, before the coral was reclad and the sign taken down, it had been the Halcyon, 31 rooms and a bar that caught the morning light, built by a man named Thomas Bennett, who had mortgaged everything he owned, and a few things he didn't, to put it up. Her father used to walk her through it before it opened, room by room, telling her which one would be the honeymoon suite and which one had the best view of the storms coming in. He'd built it looking at this exact water. Then Cesare Bruno had decided he wanted the block. There'd been a permit that got pulled for reasons no one could explain. A building inspector who found violations that weren't there and missed the bribe that was. A fire in a storeroom that the insurance company declined to pay, citing an arson finding from an investigator on Bruno's payroll, a lender who called the note the same week, and a headline, "Hotelier under investigation," that ran on a Sunday and stayed in the water long after the story was quietly dropped, because a headline doesn't need to be true to drown a man. Thomas Bennett lost the Halcyon at auction to a shell company, watched Cesare Bruno recut the ribbon on his own hotel 18 months later, and died the following spring of a coronary. His doctor described gently, as the kind stress builds. He left a widow whose heart was failing on the same bay he'd built beside, and a daughter who baked bread for a living, now in a rented storefront, and knew exactly who had done it, and had spent 9 years learning that knowing was worth precisely nothing. Until tonight. "You made it," said Grace Molina, materializing at her elbow with 2 glasses she'd lifted off a tray. Grace ran the front of Nora's little bakery and had refused, absolutely refused, to let her walk into this alone. "You look, Nora, you look like a sunrise. That's the point, right? That's the point. Right. That's the point. And you're sure about?" Grace's eyes flicked to the far side of the room, where a man stood very still in a room full of people who couldn't quite stop moving. Him. Nora followed her gaze. She'd heard the name for years, the way you hear about a hurricane sitting off the coast, a thing with your city's name in its mouth that you could do nothing about but board up and wait. Damiano Vitale wasn't the biggest man at the gala, and that was the whole trouble with him. He had the stillness of the eye of the storm, the calm that isn't peace, and people had begun to drift away from his corner of the room without letting themselves know they were doing it. He caught her looking. He didn't smile. He looked at the clock on the far wall and then back at her and inclined his head a quarter inch. "We're on time." Nora had met him 4 months ago, though the guests, laughing at her dress, didn't know that. He'd walked into her bakery on a dead Tuesday, ordered a coffee he didn't drink, and told her, without preamble, that he knew who her father was and who had buried him. He was going to war with Cesare Bruno, he said, for his own reasons. Bruno had been moving into Vitale water for 2 years, the slow, polite way rot moves through a hull, and he'd learned that the fastest way into a careful man is through the one person that careful man had been too arrogant to look at twice. He'd offered her money. He'd offered her protection. He'd offered, in an oblique way she'd only understood later, more than either. She'd turned all of it down and offered him something better instead, herself as a partner. Because she'd grown up in that hotel and knew things about the bones of it and the man who stole it that no accountant of his ever could. She knew the Halcyon had a service passage that the rebrand had drywalled over but never removed. She knew Cesare Bruno held his private files in the old manager's office because he was a creature of habit, and habit was the one thing careful men could never quite launder. She knew the gala would be held here, in her father's ballroom, on the anniversary of the auction, because Cesare Bruno enjoyed the taste of his own cleverness far too much to hold it anywhere else. "Give me one night," she'd told Damiano. His night. The one where he's showing off, when everyone he's ever cheated is in one room feeling flattered to be invited. Get me into that room, and by morning we take it all. He'd looked at her for a long moment across the flour-dusted counter. In 20 years, he'd said, nobody has ever handed me a better plan than the one the baker just drew on a napkin. So they'd spent 4 months loading the gun, and tonight, on Damiano's arm, in a dress the color of the morning that was coming, Nora Bennett walked into her father's stolen house to fire it. The dress was a fight before it was armor. The stylist Damiano's people had sent, a precise, apologetic man named Fabian Cross, had circled her twice and started pulling long, dark things off the rack, murmuring about verticals, about columns, about drawing the eye up and away from the body, about the kindness of minimizing. With your figure, the whole game is not letting the eye settle anywhere, he'd explained, holding a charcoal sheath against her like a verdict. We hide the waist. We lengthen. You're dressing her to say sorry before she says anything else. Damiano had come in without a sound. He pushed the rack of dark clothes aside with the flat of his hand, slow and final, the way you slide away a plate you're done with. She's walking into that room to end a man in front of everyone who ever bowed to him. She's not doing it disguised as an apology. Out. Fabian had gone. Damiano had turned. What do you want to wear? Nobody had asked her that in 9 years. She'd had to look at the floor for a second. Gold, she'd said. Molten gold, the color of the first light off the water. The exact color my father painted the trim of that hotel before Bruno had it stripped. Heavy silk, cut to hold its own shape. Nothing that hides in the folds. Bare shoulders and bare arms. She'd lifted her chin. I've spent my whole life being told to fold myself smaller so I'd fit in other people's rooms. I'm walking into the biggest room in my father's house, and I want to be the brightest thing in it. Let every one of them look. Looking is the first mistake they'll make tonight. Enzo Marchetti, Damiano's silent right hand, had taken his hands out of his pockets. Camilla Ashford found her at the door, of course. She always found the softest thing in a room, the way water finds the lowest floor. "Oh!" she'd said, drifting close in a column of pale gray, taking in the whole of Nora with luxurious, unhurried cruelty. "Gold. On you. This. Brave. Truly. Most women would want something that draws less attention, wouldn't they? Something forgiving." She'd smiled, delighted with herself, pitching it just wide enough for the little crowd at the door to catch. "You wore gold to your own funeral, sweetheart. I almost admire it." Somebody laughed. Gerald Thorne, hovering near the Bruno money the way he always did, laughed loudest and put a familiar hand on Nora's bare shoulder, jovial and proprietary, steering her toward the crowd like an exhibit. "She's a good sport," he announced. "Look at her. Not a word. That's a woman who knows her place, isn't it?" Every eye. The pressure of the storm pressing on the glass. 9 years of exactly this, filed away, brick on brick. Take your hand off her. It came from a few feet away, at conversational volume, and the whole door went silent as if a switch had been thrown. Gerald's hand left her shoulder. He looked at it afterward as though it had moved without him. "Mr. Vitale, we were only. You had your hand on her." Damiano didn't raise his voice. He never had to. "Do it again, and they'll reset the arm in a way that aches when the weather turns. And every storm off this bay for the rest of your life you'll remember tonight." He glanced at the hand, filing it. "That's not temper. Temper's loud. That was just the forecast. Nobody breathed. Out over the water, the lightning walked closer. He turned to Camilla and looked at her for a long, unhurried beat, and Nora watched a woman who'd been cruel in public since childhood find the cold floor beneath the floor she thought she stood on. "You make rooms laugh at whoever can't laugh back," he told her, gentle as anything. "It's a thin talent, and it doesn't feed you. You'll be hungry by the end of your life." He nodded once. "Enjoy the party, Miss Ashford. It's the last good one you'll be invited to." Then he set his hand at the small of Nora's back, light, a question, not a claim, and walked her into the ballroom, into her father's house, and the clock above the door read 9:15. They had until sunrise. It was enough. By 11, the first charge went off, and none of them heard it. Because money doesn't make a sound when it stops moving. Nora had spent 4 months teaching Damiano's people where to look, because she knew what a hotel's books actually looked like from the inside. The Castellane wasn't just a hotel. It was the beating heart of how Cesare Bruno turned filthy money clean. A property that expensive, with that much cash flowing through restaurants and events and a casino floor upstairs, could absorb a fortune and call it revenue. But Nora had grown up in the back office of a hospitality business, and she knew that occupancy leaves a trail. You cannot launder money through hotel rooms that were never slept in without the linens and the water bills and the staffing telling on you. "He's reporting 90% occupancy on a tower that runs half empty," she'd told Damiano and Enzo weeks ago over the numbers she'd walked out of a supplier's office in a bakery box. "The rooms are ghosts. He's charging phantom guests to move dirty cash through his clean receipts. You don't need a witness. You need a forensic accountant, a subpoena for the utility records, and a regulator who's been waiting years for one clean thread to pull." She'd looked up. "The whole hotel is a souffle. You just have to open the oven at the right minute." At 11 that night, while Cesare Bruno gave a speech about giving back the thread got pulled in 3 cities at once, a coordinated regulatory filing timed to the minute, that Damiano's lawyers had spent 4 months and Nora's knowledge building. By midnight, $90 million of Bruno money was frozen midair, and every account he'd have reached for to fix it was suddenly a room the government could walk into. Cesare Bruno finished his speech to warm applause and had no idea he was already ruined. At 1 in the morning, the traitors surfaced because the pressure Nora and Damiano applied was designed to make snakes move. She'd suspected for weeks. Damiano had known longer. Renzo Fontana had been Damiano's underboss for 8 years, his trusted right hand at every table. The charming one who remembered your mother's birthday and brought marzipan at Christmas. And he had been Cesare Bruno's man the entire time. The leak that had let Bruno slither into Vitale water in the first place. Tonight, with the accounts freezing and Cesare beginning, at last, to panic, Renzo did what frightened men do. He tried to get ahead of the collapse. Nora, moving through the party invisibly the way large, quiet women are permitted to move, watched Renzo slip out to the terrace and make a call he thought was private. And she stood behind a pillar in her gold dress and listened to a man sell out both his masters at once, offering Cesare's head to the federal prosecutor in exchange for his own skin. And she recorded 90 seconds of it on a phone in her clutch, because the woman they'd all been laughing at had been standing close enough to hear every word all night. At 2, the storm broke, and so did the night's one moment of real danger. They came for Damiano in the old service passage. The one the rebrand had drywalled over but never torn out. The one Nora had known about since she was a girl. He'd gone down there alone to meet what he thought was a frightened Renzo ready to flip, because the only person who told him Renzo would be there was Renzo. Nora had a bad feeling, and she trusted her bad feelings now, so she'd gone to the kitchen first. The kitchen she knew. In the hotel she'd grown up in. And she came down the service passage a different way, and that was the only reason Damiano Vitale didn't die under his own father's stolen hotel. There was a man in the passage who had no business there, still in the way that living rooms are never. Still, empty hands loose and ready. Later, Enzo would tell her his name was Cain, and that he'd done this 11 times and buried 11 people and never once been seen leaving. He had a blade already out, low against his leg, and Damiano's back was to him. There was no time to shout. Nora had a marble rolling pin in her hand. She'd taken it off the pastry station on her way through the kitchen because her hands in a crisis went to the tools they knew. And a baker's hands know a rolling pin the way a soldier's know a rifle. 2 years of hauling 50-pound sacks of flour up from a basement had built something into her shoulders that nobody at that gala would have believed to look at her. She swung it into the back of his skull with everything she had, and while he staggered, she hooked a rolling rack of catering trays and brought the whole steel thing down on top of him in an avalanche of silver and noise. Damiano spun. What happened in the next minute was fast and quiet and final, and Nora didn't look away, because she'd chosen this, and looking away would have made it a thing that happened to her instead of a thing she did. Then his hands were on her face, shaking. The eye of the storm, the man, the whole coast feared his hands going like a boy's, checking her arms, her throat, saying her name once low, testing whether the ground still held. He wasn't sent for me, Nora got out. Damiano. He was waiting for you. And only 3 people knew you'd be down here alone. I know. It's Renzo. I have him on tape an hour ago, selling you both to the prosecutor. I know. His forehead dropped to hers and he shut his eyes. I've known for a week. I needed him to reach so I'd have him clean, and I let him reach, and he reached at you, and his voice fractured, all the terrible exactness gone out of it. I put myself down here as bait, and he sent a knife at the one person in this world I croaked. He stopped. Tell me to stop, right now. And I put you and your mother somewhere he can never reach, and you never see me again. Nora took 2 fistfuls of his soaked collar and pulled him down and kissed him. It was not gentle, and it was not a beginning. It was a woman taking a thing the whole world had spent 33 years insisting she had no permission to want. And his hand came up into her hair, and he made a low broken sound against her mouth, like a man finally setting down a weight so old he'd forgotten it had an end. No, she said against his lips. We finish it, tonight, before the sun's up, like I promised, and you stop deciding what I'm allowed to walk through. She pulled back to look at him, partners, all the way to sunrise. Yes, he said, wrecked. God help every one of them. Yes. At 4, they took Cesare Bruno in the old manager's office he'd never had the imagination to move out of, with the storm still lashing the hurricane glass in the first gray, barely thinking about the edge of the sky. Renzo Fontana was already in the chair when Nora walked in beside Damiano. He'd been marched up from the terrace. He was still looking for the easy smile that had carried him through 8 years of Sunday dinners, and he couldn't find it anywhere. Boss, he said. Damiano, whatever she played you, you've been Bruno's man in my house for a decade, Damiano said in the flat, even voice he'd used to send back a cold plate. You gave him our routes. You gave him our water. And 11 years ago, before you were ever mine, you're the one who told Cesare that Thomas Bennett's little hotel was worth taking. He nodded, slow. You brought my mother marzipan last Christmas, the little fruits. She keeps the box. He nodded again. That's the part I keep turning over. The box. Renzo stopped looking for the smile. Nora set a folder on the desk, the manager's desk, the one her father used to sit behind, and opened it herself. Then she did the thing she'd spent 33 years being told her body had no right to do. She sat on the edge of that desk, took up exactly as much room as she pleased, and looked a 70-year-old killer in the eye until he had no choice but to look back at the woman he'd spent the whole night watching other people laugh at. You built this hotel on my father's grave, she said. And you held your party in his ballroom on the anniversary of the day you stole it because you thought that was clever. You wore a good suit and gave a speech about giving back. She turned a page. Every clean dollar you've moved through the Castelline in 9 years froze at midnight while you were still talking. Renzo signed his cooperation an hour ago. I have him on tape, and so does the prosecutor now. And the arson investigator who lied about my father's fire? He retired to a house he couldn't afford, and this afternoon he decided he'd rather talk than go down for you. She looked up. You gave Renzo 20 years, and he sold you in one phone call. You gave that inspector a fortune, and he'll sell you for a lighter sentence. That's what you built, Cesare. A house of people who all leave the second the tide turns. And the tide turned at 11. Cesare Bruno looked at Renzo. Renzo looked at the floor, and Nora Bennett watched a careful man understand in real time on the last night of the life he knew that he'd been taken apart by the two people he'd been far too important to look at. A mobster he'd underestimated and a baker he'd never seen at all. "You want me on my knees," Cesare said. "No," Nora said. "I want you awake. All the way through it, awake, watching. My father didn't get awake. He got a headline and a rented room. I just wanted you to see the sun come up over the hotel one last time before they take it. It's a beautiful view. He built it that way on purpose. Salvatore Conti, the old consigliere who'd counseled the Vitale family 40 years and had doubted the baker twice in the early days, rose slowly from the chair in the corner where he'd watched it all and said nothing. And the standing was the whole blessing. The federal agents came at 5 before the storm had fully passed and led Cesare Bruno out through the lobby of the hotel he'd stolen past the staircase he'd kept in handcuffs, while the last of his guests, the ones who hadn't already fled when the accounts froze, watched from the ballroom door and understood all at once exactly whose party they'd been laughing at. By the time the sun came up over Biscayne Bay, it was done. The indictment ran to 22 counts. The Castellane went into federal receivership by the end of the week, and Nora bought back one thing at the auction for cash quietly. Not the hotel was a tomb, but the original brass sign, the one that said the Halcyon, which Bruno had crated and kept in storage because even he couldn't quite bring himself to destroy something that beautiful. She hung it in her bakery, over the window that caught the morning light. Renzo Fontana took his deal and his 11 years and a name no one in that city will say aloud at a table again. Gerald Thorne, exposed in the same filing, went from Bruno's errand boy to a witness to nothing at all. Camilla Ashford married a man in Cartagena and stopped answering Miami's calls, which is what Miami does instead of a verdict. Margaret Bennett got her new heart in July on the bay her husband had built beside and cried, and told the whole recovery ward that her daughter had always been the strong one. The family had just been too busy drowning to see it. Nora and Damiano married in the fall on the water at sunrise because she'd developed a fondness for that particular hour. She wore gold again. Everyone understood. And when the man the whole coast feared said his vows in that even voice that never once had to climb, he promised to be exact about her every day he was breathing. And half the hard men in the room went still, because they knew precisely what exact meant when he said it. And they understood that the woman in gold was no longer anyone in that city could afford to laugh at. They spent a whole night laughing at her dress. Not one of them stopped to wonder why a woman with nothing would walk into a room full of wolves wearing the brightest thing in it. They were so sure she was there to be looked at that it never occurred to them she was there to look back, to count them, to time them, to watch which ones laughed loudest so she'd know which ones to take first. That's the danger of the person you decide is only there to be mocked. You perform for her. You let your guard all the way down, and she remembers every face. So think hard before you laugh at someone in a beautiful dress. She may have worn it so you'd be too busy staring to notice the sun coming up on everything you own. If her reckoning gave you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who's done watching heroines wait to be saved, and subscribe for the next story. Then tell me down in the comments, who should she come for next?